Right now, while you're watching this, 2,500 people on the north shore of Oahu are going about their lives, dropping kids at school, making coffee, checking their phones, with 2.6 billion gallons of water hanging above their heads. Behind them, a wall of compacted dirt. Ahead of them, a government that's been warning about this exact catastrophe since 1978. And between them and total annihilation on March 20th, 2026, less than 3 feet, the width of your kitchen countertop. That's it. Stay with me. Because what happened at Wahiawa Dam is not just a Hawaii story. It's a warning that belongs to every American city, every town, every family living beneath one of the 91,000 aging dams scattered across this country right now. Close your eyes for a second and picture this. It's 3 in the morning on March 20th, 2026. The Hawaiian sky has been pouring rain for hours. Not a drizzle, not a typical tropical shower, but a full atmospheric assault. Mount Kaala, the highest peak on Oahu, has just received 16 inches of rainfall in a single day. To put that in perspective, that's more precipitation than London, England sees in an entire 3-month period, hammered into one volcanic mountainside in 24 hours. Every creek is overflowing. Every drainage ditch is a river. Every road on the north shore is vanishing under fast-moving brown water. Kamehameha Highway, the main artery connecting the towns of Haleʻiwa and Waialua to safety, is completely submerged and closed in both directions. And somewhere in the darkness above these towns, behind an 88-foot-tall wall of compressed earth that was constructed when Teddy Roosevelt was still in the White House, a reservoir called Lake Wilson is rising. Not slowly, it's rising fast. And it has not stopped. The reason this matters is not just that a storm hit. Hawaii gets storms. The reason this matters is what is sitting at the top of that hill, who built it, who owns it, who ignored it, and what the instruments were reading when the sun came up. Because when the numbers rolled in on the morning of March 20th, the people whose job it is to stay calm, the engineers, the dam safety professionals, they weren't calm. And that alone should make every single one of us stop and pay attention. Let's make sure you understand exactly what we're talking about, because the details matter. The Wahiawa Dam is not a sleek, modern concrete structure engineered with redundant safety systems and 21st century monitoring technology. It is an earthen dam, which means it is, at its most fundamental level, a very large and very carefully packed pile of soil. No concrete core, no steel reinforcement at its heart. Compacted earth and rock fill shaped into a wall 88 feet tall, stretching across a valley on Oahu's central plateau. It was constructed in 1906. Not as a flood control measure, not as a public utility, but to hold irrigation water for sugarcane fields that haven't been farmed in decades. The economic purpose that justified building this structure vanished long ago, but the structure itself remained. It remained, and it aged, and it was largely left alone. Behind that wall sits Lake Wilson, a reservoir holding approximately 2.6 billion gallons of water. That number can feel abstract, so here is what it actually means. A single billion gallons is enough water to fill more than 1,500 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Multiply that by 2.6, and you have the volume that was pressing against this aging earthen embankment on March 20th. An almost unimaginable mass of water, obeying only gravity, held back by soil. The dam's spillway, the concrete channel designed to drain excess water before it reaches the top of the dam, has a discharge capacity of approximately 24,500 cubic feet of water per second. That sounds like a lot. That sounds like it should be enough. Here's the problem. Engineers have calculated what they call a probable maximum flood for this watershed, essentially the largest storm this specific valley could physically produce. And that event would push water into this reservoir at a rate more than 3 times what the spillway can handle. 3 times. Not 10% over, not 50% over. More than 300% of the spillway's maximum capacity would be rushing into Lake Wilson in the worst-case scenario that engineers are required by professional standard to plan for. That gap between what the spillway can drain and what the watershed can send, has been in the official record since 1978. And what happened next, over the 48 years between that first documented warning and the morning of March 20th, 2026, is a story that should make you genuinely furious. But first, let me tell you what the instruments were showing, because the numbers are staggering. At 8:40 in the morning on March 20th, 2026, a state dam safety engineer checked the gauge on Lake Wilson and read a number that made his stomach drop. 85.3 feet. The crest of the Wahiawa Dam, the absolute top of that earthen wall, sits at 88 feet. Do the math. The gap between the surface of the water and the top of the dam was 2 feet and 9 inches, less than 3 feet. The entire margin separating 2.6 billion gallons of water from an uncontrolled catastrophic release downstream was roughly the height of a 2-year-old child standing on their tiptoes. And the rain was still falling. The spillway had already been overwhelmed hours earlier, By the time the sun was up, the spillway was discharging water at a furious, roaring rate, and even so, it couldn't keep pace with what was pouring down from the mountains. The watershed feeding Lake Wilson had been pounded so relentlessly that every hillside, every field, every stream channel was completely saturated. The ground itself had stopped absorbing anything. Every single raindrop landing anywhere in that watershed was flowing, within minutes, directly into the reservoir. There was no buffer left. But here is the critical detail that transforms this from a weather story into a catastrophe story. This was the second Kona low in 7 days. A Kona low is a powerful winter storm system that pulls moisture-saturated air from the south across the Hawaiian Islands, concentrating rainfall in sudden violent bursts. Just 1 week before March 20th, another Kona low had already hammered Oahu's north shore. That first storm had already driven the reservoir to alarming levels. The ground never had a chance to drain. Lake Wilson never had a chance to drop back to safe operating range. And then the second storm arrived, hitting soil that was already waterlogged, a reservoir that was already elevated, and a dam that was already under scrutiny. And it just kept raining. Research from North Carolina State University, based on the study of 552 dam failures across the continental United States, reveals something critically important. Most of those failures did not occur during a single record-breaking storm. The vast majority happened following consecutive rainfall events. Moderate storms, arriving one after another over periods of 5 to 30 days, where the reservoir was already preloaded with water before the final event arrived. The research identified saturated soil and elevated reservoir levels as the single most predictive factor in dam failure. Not storm intensity alone, pre-existing water volume, plus the next storm. That is, with haunting precision, the exact sequence that played out at Wahiawa Dam in March 2026. And while the instruments were showing 85.3 feet, while engineers were watching that number and doing the math in their heads, what was happening in the neighborhoods below tells its own story. 7 miles, that's the distance from the base of the Wahiawa Dam to the Pacific Ocean. 7 miles of valley floor that includes farmland, 2-lane highways, residential streets, schools, and the homes of generations of families who have lived on Oahu's north shore their entire lives. Haleʻiwa is a town of roughly 4,000 people, the kind of place where roosters wake you before the alarm does, where locals know each other by name, and where Saturday mornings smell like shave ice and salt air. Waialua, just down the road, is smaller, an agricultural community where families have worked the same land for generations, whose grandparents and great-grandparents once tended the very sugarcane fields that made the Wahiawa Dam necessary in the first place. These are not statistics. These are neighborhoods. Kathleen Pahanui lives in Waialua. She picked up her phone in the dark hours of March 20th and began quietly packing. She didn't shout. She didn't panic for the cameras. She made arrangements to drive to a friend's home on higher ground, and before she left, she told the Associated Press exactly what she was feeling. She said, "Just pray for us. We understand there is more rain coming." That sentence is not dramatic. It is the opposite of dramatic. It is the quiet, bone-deep dread of someone who knows, not from a news alert or an engineering report, but from lived memory, that the water up on that hill is real, the wall holding it back is old, and that this moment has been threatening to arrive for as long as she can remember. Rockwell. I was a farmer on that same north shore. Her property in Waialua sits in the direct path of what would become Lake Wilson's exit route if the dam let go. She didn't evacuate. Her animals were there, goats, dogs, livestock, and this is her land, and she made the decision to stay. By midnight, her goats were standing in knee-high water. The floodwater wasn't coming from the dam. It was coming from the overwhelming rainfall itself, the same storm that was filling the reservoir, drowning the fields, swallowing the roads, and cutting off every route in and out of the north shore simultaneously. An hour later, the water in her elevated dog kennel had risen so rapidly that her 7 dogs had only their heads above the surface. Her nephew and son-in-law waded through chest-deep water in the darkness to pull them out one by one. When a journalist from Civil Beat reached her by text message in the early morning hours, she wrote back 4 words: "We are completely cut off." Not figuratively, not dramatically. Geographically, physically, completely surrounded by rising water on every road in every direction, with a dam 3 miles away that emergency managers were, at that very moment, describing as an imminent failure risk. At 8:34 that morning, the Honolulu Department of Emergency Management sent an alert to every phone on the North Shore. The message appeared in capital letters. It read, "Dam failure, take action, evacuate now." Not a watch, not an advisory, not a possible risk of. A direct declaration broadcast to thousands of people that a dam failure was in progress or expected, and that they needed to seek safety immediately. The evacuation bus dispatched to collect 186 people and 45 dogs sheltering at Waialua High School had almost nowhere to go. Farrington Highway, the main evacuation route, was shut down in both directions. One emergency shelter was already flooding. The roads being used to run away from the dam were disappearing under the same floodwaters the dam was generating. The people being told to evacuate had almost no means to do so, and the water behind the dam was still rising. What got us to this moment, what made this possible, what made it preventable and predicted and ignored, takes us back nearly 5 decades. Because this disaster didn't start with a storm in March 2026. It started with a piece of paper in 1978. In 1978, the year Saturday Night Fever was in theaters, the year the first GPS satellite launched, engineers conducting a formal assessment of the Wahiawa Dam's spillway reached a conclusion that was both technically precise and profoundly alarming. The spillway was too small. It lacked the physical capacity to discharge the volume of water that the surrounding watershed could theoretically produce during a worst-case storm event. The engineers documented it. They filed the report. They established in writing, in the official record, that this dam had a fundamental, measurable structural inadequacy that posed a public safety risk. That was 48 years ago. And then, almost nothing changed. You need to understand what the dam's history actually looks like, because each chapter makes the next one worse. The Wahiawa Dam wasn't just built in 1906 and left standing. It was built in 1906, failed in 1921, and was rebuilt. The original earthen embankment was overwhelmed during a storm, let go, and sent the reservoir downstream. People rebuilt it. They reconstructed the spillway. And then, over the next 105 years, that rebuilt spillway, the 1921 concrete channel, was never meaningfully upgraded. The same structure that replaced the one that failed is the same structure that was roaring at capacity on March 20th, 2026, while the water level climbed toward the crest. The dam has already failed once in its history. We rebuilt it, and then we forgot that part of the story. In 2009, the state of Hawaii began issuing formal notices of deficiency to the dam's owner, legally significant, officially documented warnings that the structure did not meet modern safety standards and required action. By the time March 20th, 2026 arrived, 4 separate notices of deficiency had been issued. 4. Not one oversight, not one bureaucratic delay. 4 separate formal warnings spanning more than 15 years of documented inaction. In 2016, state regulators became so alarmed by the dam's deteriorating condition that they made a dramatic operational decision. They dropped the maximum allowable water level from 82.5 feet all the way down to 65 feet, a reduction of more than 17 feet, specifically to create additional buffer against the risk of overtopping. The dam was no longer trusted to operate at its original design capacity. They were managing the risk by keeping the reservoir artificially low and hoping the storms would cooperate. On March 20th, the water level hit 85.3 feet. That is not just above the emergency threshold, that is 20.3 feet above the level that state regulators had deemed safe for routine operations, roughly the height of a 2-story building above the maximum level they had been trying to maintain as a safety buffer. And through all of it, the 4 deficiency notices, the reduced operating level, the documented spillway inadequacy going back to 1978, Dole Food Company owned the dam. Yes, that Dole. The pineapple logo, the fruit cups in your grocery store, the brand your kids recognize. Dole acquired the dam as part of the agricultural infrastructure that came with the sugarcane operations built by its predecessor companies. The dam's original purpose, irrigating sugarcane, no longer exists. The economic justification for Dole's ownership evaporated along with the crops, but the dam remained, and so did Dole's ownership. In 2021, the state of Hawaii finally levied a financial penalty against Dole for failing to address the outstanding deficiency notices on schedule. The fine was $20,000. $20,000. Dole's parent corporation paid out $92.4 million in dividends to shareholders between 2023 and 2026 alone. The fine for allowing a 120-year-old poorly conditioned dam holding 2.6 billion gallons above thousands of residents to remain unrepaired was equal to approximately 0.02% of 3 years of dividend payments. It was not a consequence, it was a line item. A cost of doing business that works out to less than the price of a modest used car for allowing a condition that dam's safety engineers describe as potentially catastrophic to persist year after year after year. When state dam safety engineer Tony Kovamatsu stepped in front of a microphone on the morning of March 20th, while 2,500 people were packing their cars and grabbing their children and trying to find roads that weren't underwater, he chose his words the way engineers always choose their words, carefully, measurably, precisely. He said, "We are not out of the woods yet." Engineers do not say things like that for effect. They are not making dramatic television. When a dam safety engineer makes a public statement about an active emergency, those words have been filtered through instruments, calculations, and professional liability. When Tony Kovamatsu said they were not out of the woods, he was telling you, as clearly as the language of engineering allows, that failure was a live possibility in that moment. and that the margin between safety and catastrophe had narrowed to something he could not guarantee would hold. What he knew, standing at that microphone, was that a portable inflatable rubber barrier, an aqua dam, had been deployed by Dole on top of the earthen crest in an emergency attempt to raise the effective height of the dam by 2 additional feet. This device was not part of the dam's certified design. It was not engineered for these exact conditions. It was an improvised solution deployed in a crisis, adding 2 feet of rubber to the top of a 120-year-old dirt wall while 2.6 billion gallons pressed from the other side. The extra 2 feet it provided may have been the difference between the script we're reading right now and a very different kind of headline. The margin of safety on March 20th was not engineering. It was a lucky improvisation and a storm that moved slightly differently than the worst-case model. That is not a system. That is a prayer. Because this could so easily stay abstract. Numbers on a gauge, water levels in charts. Let's be very clear about what we're actually talking about when we say catastrophic earthen dam failure. Let's describe it precisely, so there's no confusion about the stakes. When water overtops an earthen dam, when it spills over the crest and begins flowing down the downstream face, erosion begins immediately. The water doesn't seep through gradually. It doesn't give warning. It begins actively consuming the dam itself. The flowing water tears loose soil particles from the downstream embankment, carves a channel, and widens it. As the channel deepens, more water pours through. As more water pours through, the channel becomes a gorge. The structural integrity of the entire dam wall begins to disappear. Not over hours, not over days, in the time it takes to have a phone call. We know this because we have watched it happen. On June 5th, 1976, the Teton Dam in Idaho, another earthen structure, was breached. From the moment the first visible failure appeared in the embankment to the moment the dam was completely gone, the collapse took less than 2 hours. 11 people died. 14,000 cattle drowned. Floodwaters extended 100 miles downstream across southern Idaho. Damage reached over $2 billion in 1976 dollars, and the Teton Dam held 77 billion gallons, nearly 30 times the volume stored behind Wahiawa. But scale doesn't determine survival rate. Geography does. Evacuation routes do. The Teton Dam failed in rural Idaho. The Wahiawa Dam sits 7 miles from the Pacific coast, with 2 populated towns and the direct drainage path, evacuation routes that were already inundated by the same storm, a shelter that was already flooding, and an early morning alert going out to people who were, many of them, asleep. Hawaii has lived through this before. We have the receipts. On March 14, 2006, the Kaloko Dam on Kauai, another aging earthen structure, failed after a prolonged period of heavy rainfall. The collapse sent a wall of water rushing through the downstream valley. 7 people were killed. Their homes were destroyed in minutes. The dam's owner, a car dealer named Jimmy Flagger, was subsequently charged with 7 counts of manslaughter because investigators found the dam had been altered and was not maintained to required standards. 7 people who went to sleep on the night of March 13th and never woke up. Not because of a natural disaster, but because of documented human decisions about maintenance, oversight, and accountability. That was 20 years ago. In the 2 decades since Kaloko, the Wahiawa Dam received 4 deficiency notices, a $20,000 fine, and a portable rubber barrier deployed in desperation on the night a storm nearly finished what negligence had started. Here is the part of this story that the raw drama of a single near miss can obscure. Wahiawa was not alone on March 20th. While Lake Wilson was climbing toward the crest of Oahu's North Shore Dam, the same Kona low storm system was hammering the entire Hawaiian island chain. And at multiple locations across multiple islands, water infrastructure was simultaneously approaching critical levels. On Maui, retention basins near Lahaina, the community that lost 101 lives in the catastrophic wildfire of August 2023, a community still actively rebuilding from one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern American history, were nearing capacity. Authorities upgraded the evacuation advisory for parts of Lahaina to a full evacuation warning. A neighborhood that had barely begun to process the trauma of watching its homes burn was being told to evacuate again because the water infrastructure surrounding it was overflowing in the same storm pushing Wahiawa to its limit. On Kauai, reservoirs at Alexander and Hanapepe surpassed their watch thresholds during the same event. On Oahu, the Nuuanu Pali Reservoir also exceeded its watch level. This was not one dam under stress during an unusual storm. This was multiple water infrastructure systems across multiple Hawaiian islands, simultaneously approaching their failure thresholds in a single weather event. Not one warning light on a dashboard, an entire panel of warning lights, all blinking at once on a system built largely over a century ago for a climate that no longer exists. The Kona low storm system that drove this event is not a random act of weather. Atmospheric scientists at the University of Hawaii and researchers cited by the National Weather Service have been consistent and clear. The intensity and frequency of extreme rainfall events in Hawaii is increasing in direct correlation with rising ocean temperatures in the surrounding Pacific. A warmer ocean means more water vapor in the atmosphere. More water vapor means storms that carry and drop heavier rainfall loads. Heavier rainfall loads overwhelm infrastructure that was engineered for the rainfall patterns of 1906, not the rainfall patterns of 2026 and beyond. The Wahiawa Dam was designed for a different climate. It is now operating barely in a hydrological reality that has moved beyond its original design parameters in every direction that matters. And it is not unique. It is representative. There are currently over 91,000 dams in the United States. Thousands of them are classified as high hazard, meaning that their failure would likely result in loss of human life. Many of them are earthen structures built in the early 20th century for agricultural or industrial purposes that no longer exist. Many of them have aging spillways. Many of them sit above communities with limited evacuation routes. Wahiawa is not the exception. It is the preview. 1 week after the crisis, on March 27, 2026, the board overseeing the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources voted to authorize the state to assume ownership of the Wahiawa Reservoir from Dole Food Company. After decades of private corporate ownership, 4 formal deficiency notices, a token fine, and a near catastrophe that came within 3 feet of becoming a mass casualty event, the state of Hawaii is finally taking the wheel. The state legislature had, in 2023, already passed a law authorizing the acquisition and allocated $5 million to purchase the spillway land and $21 million to repair and expand the spillway to meet current safety standards. The Department of Agriculture and Biosecurity has projected it can complete the safety upgrades by early 2029, 3 years from now. The Kona low season runs every winter. State engineers cannot tell you exactly how powerful the next storm will be. They cannot give you the exact date the next Kona low will make landfall. That is not scientific evasion. That is the genuine, honest boundary of what predictive meteorology can currently do. What the science can tell you, what it says with increasing confidence, is that the trend lines are moving in one direction. Warmer oceans, more intense rainfall, shorter recovery windows between events, more consecutive storms hitting watersheds that haven't fully drained from the previous one. In other words, the exact conditions that brought Wahiawa to 85.3 feet in March 2026 are not a once-in-a-generation anomaly. They are a rehearsal. Kathleen Pahanui went back to Waialua after the evacuation orders lifted. She helped her neighbors. She cleaned what the water left behind in her streets and her yard. She said what you'd probably say if you lived there, that she hopes the state acts quickly, that she hopes the repair work gets done, that she hopes this winter turns out to be gentler than the last one. And then she went inside, and she started watching the sky, because Kathleen Pahanui knows what the engineers know, and what the documents know, and what 48 years of official warnings know. She knows that the gap between what that dam can handle and what the sky can deliver has been closing for decades. And that, on March 20th, 2026, it came down to 3 feet, a rubber barrier deployed in a panic, and a storm that flinched at the last moment. She knows the storm doesn't always flinch, so here is where we are. An earthen dam built in 1906, rebuilt in 1921 after it already failed once, rated poor condition by the very engineers responsible for keeping it standing, documented as structurally inadequate since 1978, hit with 4 formal deficiency notices starting in 2009, fined $20,000, a number that vanishes into the rounding errors of a company paying out $92 million in dividends, while the spillway stayed the same width, and the concrete grew no stronger, and the reservoir grew no safer. Now owned by the state, finally, with a safety upgrade projected for completion in early 2029, funded by a $26 million allocation that assumes no budget overruns, no permitting delays, no contractor issues, no political disruption, and no catastrophic storm arriving before the work is done. The dam safety engineer stood at a microphone while 2,500 people ran for their lives and told us, in the careful, measured language of someone reading from instruments and not from a script, that they were not out of the woods yet. The woods are still there. The rain will come back. And the one question that no engineering report, no state agency acquisition, no corporate press release, and no emergency alert system can answer, the question that Kathleen Pahanui carries with her every time she looks at the sky above Waialua, is the simplest and the most devastating one. What happens when the next storm arrives before 2029? If that question made you feel something, share this video, because the more people who understand what earthen dam rated poor actually means, the harder it becomes for the next $20,000 fine to be the entire consequence of the next 15 years of inaction. This is not over, and it is not only Hawaii. Drop a comment below. Does a high hazard dam sit above your community? You might be surprised by what you find.